Hello everyone, my name is Soumya Srivastav and I'm going to present Introduction to vRealize Orchestrator Client 7.4 today in this video. Topics that will be covered in this module are workflow elements, operators and some simple examples, Orchestrator Client Perspectives, managing workflows, scheduling workflows, export-import workflows, some other key concepts. Now, let's first have a look at the Orchestrator client using the VMware vRealize Orchestrator client. Now, let's learn how to log in. Log into the Orchestrator client from the Orchestrator Appliance web console. To perform general administration tasks or to edit and create workflows, you must log in to the Orchestrator Client interface. The Orchestrator Client interface is designed for developers with administrative rights who want to develop workflows, actions, and other custom elements. Note: ensure that the clock of the Orchestrator appliance and the Orchestrator client machine are synchronized. Prerequisites to login: download and deploy the Orchestrator appliance. Verify that the appliance is up and running. Install 64-bit Java on the workstation on which you will run the Orchestrator client. Please note, 32-bit Java is not supported. Now let's learn the login procedure. In the web browser, go to the IP address of the Orchestrator appliance, type the IP address. Now click Start Orchestrator Client. Enter the IP or the domain name of the Orchestrator appliance in the hostname text box. The IP address of the Orchestrator appliance is displayed by default. Log in by using the Orchestrator client username and password. Depending on whether you use vRealize Automation or vSphere as an authentication provider, enter the respective credentials to log in to the Orchestrator client. If multi-tenancy is enabled on your Orchestrator 7.4, enter the respective system administrator or tenant administrator username, password, and tenant ID. In the security warning window, select an option to handle the certificate warning. The Orchestrator client communicates with the Orchestrator server by using an SSL certificate. A trusted CA does not sign the certificate during installation. You receive a certificate warning each time you connect to the Orchestrator server. You get the following options. Ignore. Continue using the current SSL certificate. The warning message appears again when you reconnect to the same Orchestrator server or when you try to synchronize a workflow with the remote Orchestrator server. Cancel option. Close the workflow and stop the login process. Install the certificate and do not display any security warning for it anymore. Select this checkbox and click Ignore to install the certificate and stop receiving security warnings. Now let's have a look at the workflow operators and try to understand what they are used for. First workflow element. Start workflow. The starting point of the workflow. All workflows contain this element. A workflow can have only one start element. Start elements have one output and no input and cannot be removed from the workflow schema. Second element, scriptable task. General purpose task you define. You write JavaScript function in this element. Third, decision element. A Boolean function. Decision element takes one input parameter and return either true or false. The type of decision that the element makes depends on the type of input parameter. Decision elements let the workflow branch into different directions. Depending on the input parameter the decision element receives, if the received input parameter corresponds to an expected value, the workflow continues along a certain route. If the input is not expected value, the workflow continues on an alternative path. Fourth, custom decision. Again, it is a Boolean function. Custom decision can take several inputs and process them according to the custom script. Returns either true or false. Fifth, user interaction. Lets the user pass new input parameter to the workflow. You can design how the user interaction element presents the request for input parameter. Next, decision activity. A Boolean function. A decision activity returns decision activity. A Boolean function. A decision activity runs a workflow and binds its output parameter to true or false path. Waiting timer. Used by long running workflows. When a running workflow arrives at the waiting timer element, it enters a passive path. You set an absolute date at which the workflow resumes running. While it is waiting for the date, the workflow token is in waiting signal state. Waiting event. Used in long running workflows, when a running workflow arrives at the waiting element, it enters a passive state. You define a trigger event that the workflow awaits before it resumes running. While it is in waiting state, the workflow token is in waiting signal state. Now let's look at the Orchestrator Client Perspectives. Orchestrator Client Perspectives. You can access different views in the Orchestrator client by selecting one of the three perspectives. Each perspective offers specific functionality. You can select a perspective by using the drop-down list on the main menu in the Orchestrator client. The default view is Run. Now let's have a look at the three perspectives. Run view. You can schedule tasks, manage policies, run workflows, access the inventory, and manage permission from the My Orchestrator view. This perspective also gives you an overview of the recent activities. Second design perspective. You can create and modify workflows and actions. You can also manage resources, configuration elements, and policy templates. Administer. You can access the inventory and manage authorizations and packages. Now let's have a look at the run perspective in detail. From the run perspective in the Orchestrator client, you can schedule tasks, manage policies, run workflows, access the inventory, and manage permissions. Tabs in run perspective: My Orchestrator, Scheduler, Policies, Workflows, Inventory. Now let's learn about them in detail. My Orchestrator summarizes the most recent activities on the Orchestrator server, such as recently modified elements, pending and running workflows, completed workflows, and the workflows that are waiting for the user interaction. You can use the My Orchestrator view to perform common administrative tasks such as running a workflow, importing a package, and setting root access rights. Scheduler displays a list of all scheduled workflows. The workflows are sorted by name or date together with their status. You can use the scheduler view to create, edit, suspend, resume, and cancel scheduled workflows. Policies displays existing policies. You can use the policies view to create and apply policies. Workflows provides access to the Orchestrator workflow library. You can use the Workflows view to view information about each workflow, create, edit, and run workflows as well to interact with workflows. Inventory displays the objects of the plugin that are enabled in the work orchestrator. You can use the inventory view to run workflows on an inventory object. Now let's move to the orchestrator views in the design perspective. From the design perspective in the orchestrator client, you can create and modify workflows and actions. You can also manage resources, configuration elements, and policy templates. Workflows provide access to the orchestrator workflow library. You can use the workflow view to view information about each workflow, create, edit, and run workflows, as well to interact with the workflows. Actions provides access to the libraries of predefined actions. You can use the actions view to duplicate actions, export them to a file, or move them to a different module in the actions hierarchy list. Resources provide access to the list of resource elements. You can use the resource view to import external objects such as images, files, HTML templates, XML templates, and custom scripts and use them as resource elements in the workflows. Configurations provide access to the available configuration elements. You can use the Actions view to create configuration elements to define common attributes across an orchestrator server. Packages display a list of available packages where a selected package is used. You can use the package view to add, import, export, and synchronize packages. Inventory displays the objects of the plugin that are enabled in the orchestrator. You can use the inventory view to run workflows on an inventory object. Now let's see the orchestrator views in the administrative perspective. From the administrator perspective in the orchestrator client, you can access the inventory and manage authorization and packages. Inventory displays the objects of the plugin that are enabled in the orchestrator. You can use the inventory view to run workflows in an inventory object. Policy templates displays a list of available master policies. You can use the policy template view to create policy templates. Authorization display a list of available authorization elements. You can use the authorization view to create and edit authorization elements. Packages display a list of available packages where a selected package is used. You can use the packages view to add, import, export, and synchronize packages. Now, let's move to the next topic, user preferences on Orchestrator API Explorer. Let's talk about user preferences. You can customize the options displayed to a user of the Orchestrator client by using User Preferences tool. Your preferences are saved on the client side in the vmware-vmo.cfg file. To set the preferences, select Tools, User Preferences in the Orchestrator Client toolbar. From the User Preferences tool, you can change the following preferences: General Preferences, Workflow Preferences, Inventory Preferences, Script Editor Preferences. Now let's talk about the Orchestrator API Explorer. Orchestrator provides an API Explorer that you can use to search the Orchestrator API and see the documentation for JavaScript object that you can use in the scripted elements. You can consult an online version of the scripting API for the vCenter server plugin on the Orchestrator documentation homepage. Procedure: log into the Orchestrator client, select Tools, API Explorer. Result: the API Explorer appears. You can use it to search all the objects and functions of the Orchestrator API. Now let's learn how to manage workflows. Managing workflows. A workflow is a series of actions and decisions that you run sequentially. Orchestrator provides a library of workflows that perform common management tasks according to the best practices. Orchestrator also provides library of the individual actions that the workflow perform. Workflows combine actions, decisions, and results that, when performed in a particular order, complete a specific task or specific process in a virtual environment. Workflows perform tasks such as provisioning virtual machines, backing up, performing regular maintenance, sending emails, performing SSH operations, managing the physical infrastructure, and other general utility operations. Workflows accept input according to their function. You can create workflows that run according to the defined schedules or that run if certain anticipated events occur. Information can be provided by you, by other users, by any other workflow or action, or by an external process such as web service call from an application. Workflows perform some validation and filtration of information before they run. Workflows can call upon other workflows. For example, you can reuse in several different workflows a workflow that starts a virtual machine. You can create workflows by using the Orchestrator Client Interface integrated development environment that provides access to the workflow library and the ability to run workflows on the workflow engine. The workflow engine can also take objects from external library that you plug into the orchestrator. The ability allows you to customize process or implement functions that third-party applications provide. Now let's have a look at the key concepts of a workflow. Workflows consist of a schema, attributes, and parameters. The workflow schema is the main component of a workflow, as it defines all the workflow elements and the logical connections between them. The workflow attributes and parameters are the variables that workflow use to transfer data. Orchestrator saves a workflow token every time a workflow runs, recording the detail of that specific run of the workflow. Workflow user permissions. Orchestrator defines level of permissions that you can apply to groups to allow or deny them to access the workflows. Few workflow permissions are view, inspect, execute, edit, admin. Now let's learn about them one by one. View. The user can view elements in the workflow but cannot view the schema or scripting. Inspect. The user can view the elements in the workflow including the schema and scripting. Execute. The user can run the workflow. Edit. The user can edit the workflow. Admin. The user can set permissions on the workflow and has all other permissions. The admin permission includes the view, inspect, edit, and execute permissions. All the permissions require the view permission. If you do not set any permission on a workflow, the workflow inherits the permission from the folder that contains it. If you set permission on a workflow, those permissions override the permission of a folder that contains it, even if the permissions on a folder are more resistive. Workflow parameters. Input parameters. Most workflows require a certain set of input parameters to run. An input parameter is an argument that the workflow processes when it starts. The user, an application, other workflows, or an action passes into input parameter to a workflow for the workflow to process when it starts. For example, if a workflow resets a virtual machine, the workflow requires an input parameter, the name of the virtual machine. Output parameters. A workflow's output parameters represent the result of the workflow run. Output parameters can change when a workflow or a workflow element runs. While the workflow runs, they can receive the output parameter from other workflows as input parameters. For example, if a workflow creates a snapshot of a virtual machine, the output parameter for the workflow is the resulting snapshot. Workflow attributes. Workflow elements process data that they receive as input parameter and set the resulting data as workflow attributes or output parameters. Read-only workflow attributes act as global constants for a workflow. Writable attributes act as workflow's global variables. You can use the attributes to transfer data between the elements of a workflow. You can obtain attributes in the following ways. Define attributes when you create a workflow. Set the output parameter of a workflow element as a workflow attribute. Inherit attribute from a configuration element. Now let's learn about workflow schema, presentation, and tokens. A workflow schema is a graphical representation that shows the workflow as a workflow diagram of interconnected workflow elements. The workflow schema is the most important element of a workflow as it determines its logic. Workflow presentation. When users run a workflow, they provide the value for the input parameter of the workflow in the workflow presentation. When you organize the workflow presentation, consider the type and number of input parameters of a workflow. Workflow tokens. A workflow token represents a workflow that is running or has a run. A workflow is an abstract description of a process that defines a generic sequence of steps and a generic set of required input parameters. When you run a workflow with a set of real input parameters, you receive an instance of this abstraction workflow that behaves according to a specific input parameter you give it. This specific instance of completed or running workflow is called a workflow token. Workflow token attributes. Workflow token attributes are the specific parameters with which a workflow token runs. The workflow token attributes are an aggregation of workflow global attributes and the specific input and output parameters with which you run the workflow token. Workflow version history. Orchestrator keeps the version history of each workflow, irrespective of whether it is included in the default workflow library or whether the workflow is newly developed. By keeping the version history in the database, you can compare different workflow versions and to revert to a previous workflow version. Orchestrator creates a new version history item for each workflow when you increase and save the workflow version. Subsequent changes to the workflow do not change the current saved version. The version history is kept in the database along with the workflow itself. When you delete a workflow or an action, Orchestrator marks the element as deleted in the database without deleting the version history of the element from the database. This way, you can restore deleted workflows and actions. Now, let's move to standard workflows in the workflow library. Orchestrator provides a standard library of workflows that you can use to automate operations in the virtual infrastructure. The workflows in the standard library are logged in read-only state. To customize a standard workflow, you must create a duplicate of that workflow. Duplicate workflows or custom workflows that you create are fully editable. For information about different access rights you have when you work with the Orchestrator server depends on the type of vCenter server license. The contents of a workflow library is accessible through the workflow view in the Orchestrator client. The standard workflow library provides workflows in the following folders: configuration, JDBC, locking, mailing, etc. Set user permissions on a workflow. You set levels of permission on a workflow to limit the access that user groups can have to that workflow. You can select the users and user groups for which to set permission from the Orchestrator LDAP server. Prerequisites: create a workflow. Open the workflow for editing in the workflow editor. Add some elements to the workflow schema. Procedure. Click on Permission tab. Click the Add Access Right icon to define permission for a new user group. Search for a user group. The search result contains all the user group from the Orchestrator LDAP server that match the search. Select a user group and select the appropriate checkboxes to set the level of permissions for this user group. To allow a user from this user group to view the workflow, inspect the schema and the scripting, run and edit the workflow and change the permission, you must select all checkboxes. Click Select. The user group appears in the permission list. Click Save and Close to in vCenter Server Connected Orchestrator. Now let's see how to respond to a request for a user interaction. Workflow that require interaction from users during their run suspend their run either until the user provides the required information or until the times out. Workflows that require user interaction define which user can provide the required information and direct requests for interaction. Prerequisites. Verify that at least one user is in waiting for user interaction state. Procedure. From the drop-down menu in the Orchestrator client, select Run. Click the My Orchestrator view in the Orchestrator client. Click the Waiting for Input tab. The Waiting for Input tab lists the workflows that are waiting for user input from you or from the member of your user group that have permission. Double-click on a workflow that is waiting for input. The workflow token that is waiting for input appears in the workflow hierarchy list with the following symbol. Right-click on the workflow token and select Answer. Follow the instructions in the Input Parameter dialog box to provide the information that the workflow requires. Result. You provided information to a workflow that was waiting for user input during its run. Now let's move to the next topic, scheduling workflows. You can schedule a workflow from the Orchestrator Client Scheduler or workflow views. The user credential that start the workflow is the same as the credential you use to schedule it. Prerequisite. You must have the execute privilege to schedule a workflow. Procedure. From the drop-down menu in the Orchestrator client, select Run. Click the Scheduler view. Right-click within the left panel and select Schedule Task. Select Schedule Task as to use another user credentials to schedule a workflow. This step is optional. Search for the workflow to schedule by typing the name of the workflow, select it and click Select. Set the start date and time for the workflow. Now click Submit to schedule the workflow. The scheduled workflow is listed in the Scheduler view. An R appears next to the scheduled workflow to denote recurrence is set. What to do next? You can monitor the workflow, run and delete the scheduled task from the scheduler view. Now let's learn how to edit the workflow recurrence pattern. A recurrence pattern is used to specify in which a given workflow is scheduled. You can edit the recurrence pattern of a workflow from the scheduler view. Prerequisites. A recent workflow that is scheduled. Procedure. From the drop-down menu in the Orchestrator client, select Run. Click the Scheduler view. Right-click the scheduled workflow whose recurrence pattern you want to edit and select Edit. Click the recurrence pattern. From the drop-down menu, select the recurrence pattern. You can add an unlimited number of entries to the pattern. You can edit each entry. The display changes according to the selected pattern. Click Save and Close to exit the editor. The new recurrence pattern for the scheduled workflow appears in the Recurrence tab. What to do next? You can view the details about different runs of the scheduled workflows on the Workflow Run tab. Now, let's see use of workflow version history. You can use version history to revert a workflow to a previously saved state. You can revert the workflow state to an earlier or a later workflow version. You can also compare the differences between the current state of the workflow and a saved version of the workflow. Orchestrator creates a new version history item for each workflow when you increase and save the workflow version. Subsequent changes to the workflow do not change the current saved version. For example, when you create a workflow version and save it, the state of the workflow is stored in the version history. If you make any changes to the workflow, you can save the workflow state in the Orchestrator client, but you cannot apply the changes to the workflow version 1.0.0. To store the changes in the version history, you must create a subsequent workflow version and save it. The version history is kept in the database along with the workflow itself. When you delete a workflow, Orchestrator marks the element as deleted in the database without deleting the version history of the element from the database. This way, you can restore deleted workflows. Prerequisites. Open a workflow for editing in the Workflow Editor. Procedure. Click the General tab in the Workflow Editor and click Show Version History. Select a workflow version and click Difference Against Current to compare the differences. A window displays the differences between the current workflow version and the selected workflow version. Select a workflow version and click Revert to restore the state of the workflow. The workflow state is reverted to the state of the selected version. Now let's learn how to restore deleted workflows. You can restore workflows that have been deleted from the workflow library. Procedure. From the drop-down menu in the Orchestrator client, select Run or Design. Click the Workflow view. Navigate to the workflow folder in which you want to restore deleted workflows. Right-click the folder and select Restore Deleted Workflows. Select the workflow or workflows that you want to restore and click Restore. The restored workflows appear in the selected folder. Now let's learn how to import or export a workflow. You can export workflows to use them in another Orchestrator server instance. Procedure. From the drop-down menu in the Orchestrator client, select Run. Click the Workflow view. Browse the workflow you want to export and right-click that workflow. Select Export Workflow. Browse to locate the folder in which you want to save the workflow and click Save. The workflow is saved as .workflow file. Import a workflow. If you have exported a workflow from Orchestrator server, you can import it to another Orchestrator server. Procedure. From the drop-down menu in the Orchestrator client, select Run. Click the Workflow view. Browse the workflow folder in which you want to import the workflow and right-click it. Select Import Workflow. Browse to locate workflow you want to import and click Open. If the workflow already exists in the workflow library, a dialog box with version information appears. Note, you cannot import a workflow with an earlier version number than the version number of an existing workflow. The imported workflow appears in the workflow folder that you have selected. Now, please have a look at few examples of workflows. Here is an example of printing a string. Hello world, system.log, server.log. Second example, add an Active Directory server. Go to the library, predefined workflows, Active Directory, predefined workflow, add an Active Directory server and run this workflow. Third, add a vCenter server instance. Go to the library folder, look for the vCenter folder. Now select the workflow, add a vCenter server instance and run it with the required input parameters. So I hope the video was helpful. Goodbye and see you in the next video. Thank you.